Hey guys, how you doing? This is Mike McCormick with Advanced Criminology in Owings Mills, Maryland, and I want to update you on some things that we recently got some information on. We did some research for the past couple weeks. We haven't put anything out for the past about 5-6 days, and the information we're going to put out tonight happens to be the information where just recently one of the gun task force officers, where Detective Sean Suter was scheduled to appear the following day after he was shot on the 16th, which would have been the day he died around noon on the 16th. And he was supposed to appear before the grand jury in the Sergeant Wayne Earl Jenkins case. As you know, he was already indicted as a senior member of the gun task force in those cases. And subsequently, he was indicted again on the new case. And this case happened back April 28th, 2010. And this is where we find Officer Suter's involvement as the officer that was directed by Sergeant Jenkins to go search a vehicle. And subsequently, what was found was 28 grams of high purity heroin. As you know, if you didn't know, 28 grams is roughly shy of an ounce of heroin found in that vehicle that was planted. Now, what we didn't know, and we know now, is in the indictment. It's a 5-count indictment, and if you want to kind of look it up, if you're really into looking up stuff as far as the federal courthouse goes, you can just go ahead and Google the indictment. In reference to the United States of America versus Wayne Earl Jenkins, and you can kind of look over the indictment yourself, and what you will see is just the indictment itself, but you won't be able to figure out who they're talking about. Well, we figured out who they're talking about in every aspect of the indictment, and so tonight I wanted to name a name because when the commissioner's office was pressed from news media a few weeks ago about who this unnamed person was, sergeant was, he basically said he couldn't go into any details about that particular individual. But other than that individual had resigned in June of 2012. So we went back and did some research to find out how many sergeants resigned 2012, what their name was. We cross-referenced names in databases with the officers on the gun task force. We narrowed it down basically to a couple officers he had worked with for a number of years, really starting since 2005, 2006, long before 2010 even rolled around. And one name kept rolling in that equation of officers, and that was Officer Ginn. And so we found out that he was also an officer that was named in this indictment as well. In fact, he's the person that turned federal state's evidence. He turned evidence because they didn't have anything. And had it not been for this particular officer coming forth, they wouldn't have had as much, the feds wouldn't have had as much detail about that incident that day and how it happened and how Suter's involvement came about. So it was interesting to read, and once I read it, I said, okay, well, I can see, you know, what happened here. So, take off my glasses. So, one thing throughout the research since 2005 of all the cases we've been looking at, and we looked at over 100 some odd cases involving several members here that we're talking about in this particular indictment. So we're talking about Officer Ryan Ginn, we're talking about Detective Sean Suter, and we're talking about Sergeant Wayne Jenkins, and the unnamed sergeant, who the police commissioner could not, reveal that name, is Sergeant Richard A. Willard. That's Sergeant Richard A. Willard. This particular individual's name appears on so many court documents, it ain't funny. From 2005, 2006 on up to when he was asked to resign or be fired. That was pretty much the ultimatums that he was given at a trial board, is that he resign or be fired. And the reason that he was going to be fired is because of this particular incident here. So the commissioner's office, and this is long before Davis even got here, this would have been on Commissioner Bfield's watch when he was commissioner at that time. So this incident basically stems from 2010 and then weaves its way all the way up to this point, 2017. And so the history is pretty much unbelievable in terms of the way we were able to piece together the connection of the gun trace squad, that's what they call them, the gun task force, and this particular individual, this Sergeant Willard, was actually one of the people who helped put that unit together. So he's responsible for training Wayne Earl Jenkins, who worked under his command, who was also ultimately ended up being a sergeant as well. And what's strange about this particular indictment, when I read it, even the first page, when I read it, it just jumped out at me that it said in paragraph 3 that Jenkins joined the BPD in 2003, and he became a cop. Then he was promoted in November 30th, 2012 to a detective. And less than a year later, this guy actually is promoted again to a sergeant. And the first thing that jumped off at me is having been in the department, it's not easy to become a sergeant a year after you've been promoted to a detective, less than a year. So automatically that was a red flag for me. Because the first question that came to my mind is, who promoted this guy to a sergeant? What was in his personnel jacket? What was in his record where this guy could be recommended to become a sergeant? And even when I looked at Willard's involvement in some of the things that he was suspected of doing, and looked at his cases, we found probably 50, maybe 60 cases in the Maryland case search system where he was an arresting officer or part of an arrest team, and we found charges of first-degree murder, we found charges of robberies, we found charges of controlled dangerous substance cases that he and his team had wrote from that period of 2005, either him by himself or collectively with other people, but his name appeared on every single case search we found. His name appeared there. And what was surprising is that out of some of the 60 cases that we saw, probably maybe 5 cases out of 60 were cases that they actually got convictions on over in the Circuit Court of Baltimore City. The rest of the cases were thrown out. So when I hear the police department talking about the state's attorney's office is not doing their job in prosecuting people with handgun charges and things of that nature, I gotta pull back for a minute there, because the state's attorney's case is only as good as the case that the police make it. So if the police make a bullshit case, the prosecution can't do anything with it. So quite naturally, they're going to offer the defendants stats. They're going to dismiss cases. They're going to acquit people. These things happen all the time, but they're just not reported, in the media until something, big happens. So when you talk about, the crime, you talk about, guns being on the street, well, you can't get them off the street if the police officers are fabricating evidence from the very beginning. Because I can tell you right now, a lot of the cases that I saw looked like cases where the state attorney got these cases, looked at these cases in detail, particularly the probable cause portion of the statement of charges, and just felt in their hearts they could not move forward with prosecuting people with pretty much shaky evidence. And again, you see it in well over 90% of this particular guy's cases. So I asked myself, who evaluates this individual to be promoted to a sergeant? Or is it, what is the system, what do we have there at the police department that truly evaluates people on merit? Because there is no merit when you submit 60 cases to the state attorney's office and they end up throwing out, 55 of your cases over the course of 3 or 4 or 5 years. It just doesn't make sense. And so, you can see that there's really no checks and balances in the police department when it comes to promotions. And it seems to be probably where people are getting promoted based upon, some nepotism, some old boy network type stuff going on. And eventually when somebody gets in trouble, everybody wants to shy away from the individual. And in this case here, that's what they did with this guy. This guy was a loose cannon. From everything I've read about this guy, he's just a loose cannon. The indictment indicates that this gentleman was called to the scene of an accident where a senior citizen had been killed in a car accident after a car chase. So and so, you know, he's called there, but he's only called there to bring 28 grams of heroin to the scene. The plant, and I'm gonna tell you whose car they planted them in, because these gentlemen were just on TV. These gentlemen were just released from federal prison. One, Mr. Umar Burley, and the other one is named Mr. Brent Matthews. These gentlemen were just released from incarceration, having spent years in the system for no reason at all. No reason at all. Even when I looked at their stuff, you know, a little bit online, I saw a few things, but you know, it just didn't add up. You know, from the things that we saw. And these guys, actually, when they were charged and found guilty in the federal court system, they were facing the federal narcotic mandatory minimum for the 28 grams, which is an ounce of heroin, which is, you know, it's up to 20 years. And that's fed time. That's hard time. That's not state time where, you know, you're getting all this good behavior stuff. That's not happening. So, you know, they end up writing, and this is how, if you guys didn't know the kind of genesis of the whole story, basically these guys were sitting wallowing away in prison when they got wind that the gun trace squad was under indictment. And this guy's name came up because quite naturally, he was on their indictment. He sent them to prison. Excuse me. So when they wrote the United States Attorney's Office, you know, in Baltimore, their letter indicated that, you know, they had felt that, you know, they were mistreated in the system, and that they were set up, that they didn't have any heroin, and they wanted somebody to investigate it. And, you know, one thing led to another. But having read the indictment, the straw that broke the camel's back, as I said before, was this one guy who had always been, so to speak, one of his partners in crime, if you will, over 4 or 5 years. And so, again, the record bears this out, that these guys were, you know, were partners in crime for the longest of time in the police department. And the police department never did anything about it. They just didn't do anything about it. The police commissioner can't even get in front of TV and argue how his detective or one of his guys can present 60 cases to the state attorney's office and has a conviction rate of damn near 0, 10%, if that. So I mean, you know, it just doesn't make sense. So I just wanted to bring that up. But when we get into this particular indictment, if you get a chance to see it, read it. Paragraph 14, which is a very compelling paragraph in this indictment, and you got to kind of read between the lines, because this is the only paragraph that really doesn't make sense, you know, out of the 16 paragraphs that there are. And this paragraph says, following the incident, Jenkins listened to recorded jail cells of Mr. Umar Burley and Mr. Brent Matthews. While these guys were incarcerated, this particular sergeant decided to go and listen to their calls. And they were talking about that the heroin that was recovered in their car was in fact planted on them. So Jenkins, after Jenkins had overheard this conversation while these guys were doing time, he turned around and told officer again. And then it said that Jenkins could not testify if the case went to trial because something had been put in the car, or words to that effect, referring to the heroin that had been planted in Mr. Umar's car. Now, because it reads funny, it says, I took it to mean Jenkins told again, Officer 2, that Jenkins, it doesn't make sense that Jenkins would tell somebody about Jenkins. So I'm reading that meant that Officer Suter could not testify if the case went to trial. That's how I'm reading that. If I'm wrong, then sure, the government can kind of, you know, send me a letter or tell me I'm wrong. Police department can tell me I'm wrong, and I'll retract it. But until they present me with a better paragraph, because again, this paragraph out of all 16 does not make sense to me, and I think I can read pretty well. So that's my interpretation of what that meant. Again, if it means something else, let me know. So I bring all this up in this particular case because we have a situation here where the federal government has presented a second indictment against this guy, Jenkins. We have an unnamed sergeant who right now has retired at benefits from the city of Baltimore. He's written a book, by the way. He's getting medical benefits. And this particular guy is not under arrest. This particular guy has not been charged with crimes. And I'm trying to figure out, when is this going to happen? Because if he supplied Jenkins with 28 grams of heroin, his ass needs to be in jail. Because anybody else would be. By this time, I'm going to go back just in history here, just to update you guys on one thing. The police department was faced with a dilemma back in 2010. This guy filed a lawsuit against the police department, pretty much claiming that he was suffering from PTSD after a shooting incident that he got involved in with a few other officers. And this was back in 2005. He files this claim 4 years later about the PTSD. Well, police department and him, the FOP, they go back and forth until around 2010 rolls around, somewhere around that area there. You know, 2010 is a major deal here because this is when this whole plant deal goes down with this 28 grams of heroin. And so the police department gets wind of this particular situation with him planting the evidence. They know about it then, in 2010, that he planted evidence in these guys' cars. But they really wanted to get rid of this guy off the department. They didn't, for whatever reason. I don't know. I'm sure in hindsight now they wish they had this guy charged with a criminal crime back then in Baltimore City for supplying heroin on the streets of the city. That's what they should have charged him with. Forget the lawsuit against them. He basically filed a federal lawsuit saying that the police department did not take in consideration his PTSD, and therefore he was acting the way he acted because of the shooting that occurred back in 2005. This guy, like I say, he was off his rocker a little bit because he subsequently charged in 2011 out in Howard County for domestic violence and beating his wife's ass. So, you know, this guy was a problem. So you wonder to yourself at this point in the murder investigation of Detective Sean Suter, what role, if any, did or could or would this guy play if he was called upon to take Officer Suter's life? Because right now, nobody's saying anything. So it's all up to speculation. But the more you dig into this thing, the more you see where the police department kind of coddled this guy back in 2010 and gave him a way out the department and not really taking it to a trial board and finding them guilty and then sending that case over to the state's attorney's office in Baltimore City for further prosecution is what really should have happened once they got wind of it. Apparently the only way you knew about it is because it came from someone who was on the scene with him. Another officer turned him in. That's what happened. Else they'd have never known about it. So I wanted to bring that up and I wanted to bring that out. So today, as I said before, is the 26th, day after Christmas. And so if the news media picks up on this, which I'm sure they will, I have a few connections on one or two of the outlets, be advised, you will hear this name again. You will hear his name again because it was just unbelievable to me how the United States Attorney in this particular case on this indictment has not filed to have this guy arrested. It just doesn't make any sense. So his name is Sergeant Richard Willard, and you know, we'll be keeping tabs on this particular incident here. I think December 19th was last week. Yeah, last week, December 19th. If I'm not mistaken. It was Tuesday, the 20th. Look at my calendar. The 25th. Yeah, December 19th. It was that day that on the first indictments with the gun trace squad, Jenkins was in court for a motions hearing. Him and two other officers were in court that day, just passed. Let me see. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, those guys were in court for motions hearing. I wish I'd known. I'm keeping up the case, but I didn't know about this particular hearing because lots of times you learn a lot when you go on a hearing that you would not normally hear that's been reported on the news. You kind of can listen in between the lines of what the attorneys are talking about and what the judge is talking about in certain cases. Okay, so I'm going to leave that where it is because I'm going to follow up with what I believe the federal government's obligation is with regard to having failed to protect Detective Sean Suiter and his family. And I've gotten quite a few comments asking me about whether or not Detective Suiter should have been treated as a federal witness under the Federal Witness Protection Program. And even if he wasn't under the Federal Protection Program, should it have been something that they should have had foresight to see, that if an individual gets a summons sent to him and it's a federal summons to appear in court for a grand jury proceeding, who else knew that he was getting this summons? Who else knew he had to appear, on the 16th of November? So I have a lot to say about that because I get into the rules and regulations of witnesses, federal witnesses, and what the role of the federal prosecutor is once they send these subpoenas out, whether they're officers, whether they're opinionated witnesses that need to come in, or a regular Joe on the street. So, I have all that information, but it's a little more than what I want to present in this particular video, because this video strictly deals with what happened with the new indictment against Sergeant Jenkins. Okay, so I'm gonna leave it at that. You guys keep commenting. Make sure you subscribe so we can get our subscriber list up. And I'll add one more thing. On Thursday, this coming Thursday, which is December 28th, between 12 and 1 p.m., I'm a guest speaker on WOLB radio. That's 1010 a.m. So if you have anything to say then, if we're taking calls at the radio station, by all means, if you're local here in Baltimore, you call in. Even if you're long distance, it's WOLB 1010 a.m. It's a Baltimore radio station, and we like to hear your comments and concerns. Once again, thanks a lot, and I look forward to you making your comments as I just said. And I'll see you next time I post.